Imagine following a money rule exactly as it was designed, paying your bills, limiting your spending, saving every month, and still feeling like you're falling behind. Here's the uncomfortable question: was the rule ever broken? Or did the world simply change around it? By the end of this documentary, you will understand where the famous 50-30-20 budgeting rule came from, why it became one of the most recommended financial systems in the world, why millions of people still swear by it, why millions of others quietly abandoned it, how inflation changed the mathematics behind the rule, why wealthy people often organize their money completely differently, and perhaps most importantly, how you can decide whether this rule still deserves a place in your own financial life. Because here's something most budgeting videos never tell you. The biggest weakness of the 50-30-20 rule isn't inside the rule itself, it's hidden inside the economy it was designed for. And once you see that, you'll never look at budgeting in quite the same way again. But to understand why this system became so influential, we first have to travel back 20 years to a completely different America. The year was 2005. Netflix still mailed DVDs. The iPhone didn't exist. Social media hadn't yet reshaped how we spent money. Interest rates, housing, wages, and everyday living costs created an economy that looked very different from the one we live in today. Yet buried inside that economy was a growing problem. Millions of families were earning more than previous generations, but somehow feeling less financially secure. Bankruptcies were rising, credit card balances were growing, two-income households were struggling just to stay afloat. Most experts blamed one thing: people were spending too much, buying too many luxuries, living beyond their means. But one law professor believed the data told a very different story. Her name was Elizabeth Warren. Long before she became a United States Senator, Warren spent decades studying bankruptcy cases at Harvard Law School. She wasn't interested in telling people to skip coffee or cancel holidays. She wanted to understand something much deeper. Why were ordinary families collapsing financially, even when they appeared to be doing everything right? Together with her daughter, business consultant Amelia Warren Tyagi, she analyzed years of household financial data, and what they discovered challenged one of the biggest assumptions in personal finance. Families weren't going broke because they bought too many unnecessary things. They were being crushed by the rising cost of simply existing. Housing, healthcare, childcare, education, the essentials. The problem wasn't just spending, it was balance. And that insight became the foundation for a book that would reshape personal finance around the world. Its title was All Your Worth. But here's what's fascinating. The famous 50-30-20 rule wasn't actually created to make people rich. It was created to stop ordinary families from drowning. And that changes how we should think about it. Because once you understand the original purpose, the numbers suddenly make much more sense. Imagine someone handed you every pound, dollar, or shilling you've earned this month and asked a simple question: what exactly is this money supposed to do? Not what you hope it will do, not what you usually spend it on. What job does every single unit of currency actually have? That was the question Elizabeth Warren and Amelia Warren Tyagi wanted every household to answer. Their solution looked almost too simple. Take every pound you bring home after tax and divide it into just 3 buckets. Not 20, not 50, just 3. Because if your money has too many destinations, it usually ends up with no direction at all. The first bucket was called must-haves. This wasn't everything you bought, only the things you genuinely couldn't avoid. Your rent or mortgage, basic groceries, utilities, insurance, transport to work, minimum debt payments. If losing that expense would seriously disrupt your ability to live or earn, it belonged here. And together, those essentials should consume no more than 50% of your take-home income. The second bucket was the one many people found surprising. 30% was reserved for things you simply enjoyed. Restaurants, streaming subscriptions, weekend trips, new clothes, coffee with friends, entertainment. In other words, life. Because Warren believed something many budgeting systems ignored. If a financial plan removes every source of enjoyment, people rarely stick to it. A budget that feels like punishment usually ends in failure. So instead of eliminating pleasure, the rule gave it boundaries. Then came the final bucket, the 20%. This wasn't spending, it wasn't reward, it was protection. Money set aside for future you, building an emergency fund, paying down expensive debt, investing for retirement, creating financial resilience. On paper, the mathematics were beautifully balanced. Half your income kept your life running today, 30% allowed you to enjoy today, 20% protected tomorrow. It was elegant, easy to remember, easy to teach, and perhaps most importantly, it gave millions of people permission to stop feeling guilty every time they spent money. Because if those three buckets stayed balanced, the theory suggested your financial life would stay balanced too. And for a while, it worked remarkably well. But hidden inside those percentages was one enormous assumption, an assumption almost nobody noticed, because in 2005, it barely mattered. Today, it changes everything. The entire rule depends on one number, 50%. If that number breaks, the other two collapse with it, and that's exactly what began happening. If you've ever heard someone say, the 50-30-20 rule doesn't work anymore, they're only telling half the story. Because for millions of people, it did work. In fact, there's a reason this simple budgeting system spread around the world. The rule wasn't lucky. It matched the economic reality of its time. Imagine you're living in America in the mid-2000s. You're earning a fairly predictable salary. Inflation is relatively low. Your weekly grocery bill doesn't change dramatically from one month to the next. Housing is still expensive, but for many families, it hasn't yet reached the crushing levels we see today. When your essential living costs remain reasonably stable, keeping them below half your income isn't an impossible target. It becomes a useful boundary, and that's exactly what the 50-30-20 rule provided. Not perfection, discipline. Instead of wondering whether you could afford something, you simply asked, which bucket does this belong in? If buying something pushed your needs above 50%, something had to change. If your wants began eating into your savings, the numbers warned you before your bank account did. For many households, that simple awareness prevented small financial mistakes from becoming major financial crises. And perhaps the biggest strength of the rule wasn't mathematical at all, it was psychological. Because human beings aren't naturally good at managing money. We're emotional. We compare ourselves with friends. We reward ourselves after stressful weeks. We convince ourselves it's only one purchase. Behavioral psychologists call this present bias. Our brains naturally place more value on immediate rewards than future security. Saving for retirement feels abstract. Buying something today feels real. The 50-30-20 rule quietly fought against that instinct. It automated decision-making. Instead of asking yourself, should I save this month? The rule answered the question before you even spent your first pound. 20% already belonged to your future. It removed emotion and replaced it with structure. And that's why millions of financial advisors still recommend it today. Not because it's perfect, but because simple systems are often the ones people actually follow. If the story ended there, the 50-30-20 rule might still be one of the greatest budgeting systems ever created. But history had other plans. Because while the rule stayed exactly the same, the world around it didn't. Over the next decade, something happened that Warren couldn't have predicted. Houses became dramatically more expensive, food prices surged, healthcare costs climbed, and suddenly the very first bucket started swallowing the other two. Imagine someone handed you a map that was perfectly accurate 20 years ago. Every road was correct. Every landmark was exactly where it should be. Every direction led you safely to your destination. Now imagine trying to use that same map today. New roads have appeared. Entire neighborhoods have changed. Motorways didn't even exist when the map was printed. The map isn't wrong. It's simply describing a world that no longer exists. That's exactly what happened to the 50-30-20 rule. When Elizabeth Warren introduced it in 2005, she wasn't predicting the future. She was responding to the economy she could actually see. But economies don't stand still. And over the next 20 years, one force quietly rewrote almost every household budget on Earth: inflation. Now, inflation is one of those words we hear constantly on the news, but it's often explained in a way that feels abstract. So let's make it simple. Imagine you walked into a supermarket in 2019 with £100, you filled your trolley, paid, and went home. Fast forward a few years, you return with that same £100. The trolley looks identical, the products are identical, but when you reach the checkout, you're forced to leave items behind. Not because you bought more, but because your money now buys less. That's inflation. Your bank balance might still show the same number, but the purchasing power behind every pound has quietly shrunk. According to inflation tracking data, prices in the United States rose by more than 27% cumulatively between 2019 and 2026. That means something costing $10,000 in 2019 would cost over $12,700 just a few years later without becoming any better. The product didn't change, your money did. And inflation wasn't acting alone. Housing became an even bigger problem. Research from Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies shows that more households became what economists call cost-burdened. That simply means spending more than 30% of their income on housing alone. Think about that for a moment. Not food, not electricity, not transport, just somewhere to live. If your rent already consumes 40% of your income, the famous 50% needs bucket is almost full before you've even bought your first loaf of bread. And suddenly, the mathematics behind the rule begin collapsing. Not because people became irresponsible, not because they suddenly forgot how to budget, but because the biggest expense in modern life started growing much faster than incomes. The first bucket began swallowing everything else. And once that happened, the second bucket became smaller. The third bucket almost disappeared. Saving 20% wasn't becoming difficult. For millions of families, it was becoming mathematically impossible. But here's the twist. Not everyone responded to inflation the same way. While many households watched their savings disappear, another group quietly changed the rules completely. They didn't ask, how do I fit into the 50-30-20 rule? They asked something far more powerful. How do I redesign the buckets themselves? And that question changes everything. When the traditional budget began to break, most people tried to squeeze themselves harder, spend less, cut more subscriptions, skip another holiday, find cheaper groceries. In other words, they kept trying to fit their lives inside the same three buckets. But many wealthy people took a completely different approach. They didn't ask, how do I survive inside this system? They asked, what if the system itself could be redesigned? And that's where the real difference begins. Because contrary to what social media often suggests, wealth isn't usually built by earning dramatically more. It's built by changing what your money is actually hired to do. Most people see money as something that gets spent. Wealthy people increasingly see money as something that gets employed. Those sound similar. They're completely different. Imagine hiring 100 employees. Every month, they simply sit in an office doing absolutely nothing. You still pay them, but they never produce any work. Eventually, you'd realize your money was being wasted. Now imagine another company. Every employee has a specific job. Every hour they create value. Every month the business becomes stronger. That's how many long-term wealth builders think about money. Every pound, every dollar, every shilling must have a job. And the most important employee isn't you, it's your capital. Because unlike people, capital never sleeps. It works while you're asleep, while you're on holiday, while you're spending time with your family. And that's exactly what researchers began noticing when they studied self-made millionaires. In the landmark study behind The Millionaire Next Door, Dr. Thomas Stanley and Dr. William Danko spent decades analyzing households that quietly accumulated wealth. What surprised them wasn't how much these people earned. It was how differently they behaved. Many of the wealthiest households didn't drive luxury cars. They didn't constantly upgrade their lifestyles. They didn't spend every pay rise. Instead, they repeatedly made one decision. Every increase in income became another investment, not another expense. The researchers even gave these groups different names. They identified under-accumulators of wealth, people whose incomes grew, but whose spending grew just as quickly. And they identified prodigious accumulators of wealth, people whose lifestyles barely changed, even as their incomes increased. To most people, a pay rise means a bigger house, a newer car, more expensive holidays. Behavioral economists call this lifestyle inflation. As income rises, our expectations quietly rise with it. Yesterday's luxury becomes today's necessity. But the households building lasting wealth interrupted that cycle. Instead of asking, "What can I afford now?" they asked, "What asset can I own now?" And that tiny shift changed everything. Because while one group collected possessions, the other collected productive assets. Assets that could eventually pay for the possessions instead. One of the clearest examples came from legendary investor Sir John Templeton. Early in his career, Templeton and his wife made a decision that seemed almost unreasonable. They committed themselves to investing around half of their income. Not after becoming wealthy, before becoming wealthy. They rented a modest apartment, bought second-hand furniture, ignored social pressure to appear successful. Every pound they didn't spend became another employee working inside the stock market. Years later, those employees had multiplied into an investment empire worth billions. Templeton wasn't simply saving money, he was buying future freedom, and that's a completely different objective. But there was one more difference, one that's almost invisible. It wasn't about investing, it wasn't about saving, it was about time. Because the wealthiest people eventually realized something even more valuable than money was the number of hours they owned. And that's where the entire meaning of the needs bucket begins to change. Imagine someone offered you an extra 15 hours every single week. No catch, no extra work, no magic. Just 15 additional hours. What would you do with them? Learn a new skill? Start a business? Spend more time with your family? Or would they quietly disappear into scrolling social media? That question might sound hypothetical, but for many wealthy people, it's a financial decision they make every single day. Most of us grow up believing that saving money is always the smartest option. Clean your own house, mow your own lawn, do your own bookkeeping, answer every email yourself. Because if you can do it, why pay someone else? At first, that logic makes perfect sense, until you ask a different question. Not, how much does this cost? But, what is my time worth? That's the question many successful entrepreneurs eventually begin asking. Because unlike money, time can never be earned back. You can lose money and make it again. You cannot lose yesterday and get it back tomorrow. This idea appears again and again in business research. In The E-Myth Revisited, business consultant Michael Gerber explains why so many businesses never grow. The owners become trapped doing every small task themselves. They spend their days answering emails, organizing paperwork, handling administration, solving tiny operational problems. They're constantly working but rarely moving forward. Gerber describes the difference as working in your business versus working on your business. It's a distinction that changes everything, because every hour spent repeating routine tasks, is an hour not spent building systems that create future income. And this idea doesn't only apply to business owners, it applies to everyday life. Researchers from the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences studied something surprisingly simple. They compared people who spent money on material possessions with people who spent money buying back time, hiring a cleaner, paying for grocery delivery, using time-saving services. The results were remarkable. People who spent money to reduce everyday chores consistently reported lower stress, greater life satisfaction, and a stronger sense of control over their lives. At first glance, paying someone to clean your house might look like an expense. But what if that decision gives you 3 extra hours every Saturday? Now imagine using those 3 hours to learn a valuable skill, build a freelance business, study investing, or simply recharge enough to perform better during the week. Suddenly, the cleaner isn't the expense, the wasted time was. One of the greatest business examples of this principle came from Ray Kroc. When Kroc discovered the original McDonald's restaurant, the food was excellent, the business was profitable, but there was one problem: everything depended on the people inside the kitchen. If they stopped working, the business stopped producing. Kroc didn't build a global empire by flipping burgers faster. He built systems. Every movement inside the kitchen was documented, measured, simplified, repeated. Cooking became a process, not a performance. And because the system no longer depended on one person's time, it could be copied thousands of times around the world. The restaurant stopped being a job, it became an asset. That's the deeper lesson. The wealthiest people aren't obsessed with avoiding expenses. They're obsessed with removing bottlenecks. If spending £1 today creates £10 tomorrow, it isn't consumption, it's leverage. And that's where the meaning of the needs bucket quietly changes. For most people, needs are simply bills. For wealth builders, some needs become investments in productivity. Software that saves hours, automation that removes repetitive work, professional help that creates more freedom. The bucket hasn't disappeared, its purpose has evolved. But even after understanding assets, even after understanding time, there's one invisible force that still pulls millions of people backwards. It isn't inflation, it isn't income, it isn't bad budgeting, it's psychology. Because the greatest battle for your wealth doesn't happen in your bank account, it happens in your mind. Let's imagine 2 people. They graduate around the same time, land similar jobs, earn exactly the same starting salary, $60,000 a year, both receive roughly the same annual pay rises. Neither wins the lottery, neither inherits millions, neither discovers a secret investment. From the outside, their lives look almost identical. But over the next 40 years, they make one series of small decisions. And those decisions quietly create 2 completely different futures. Let's call them Paycheck Paul and Asset Alex. When Paul gets his first promotion, he celebrates a nicer apartment, a newer car, a few more restaurant meals every week. Nothing extravagant, just rewards for working hard. After all, isn't that the point of earning more? Every pay rise slowly improves his lifestyle. His budget still follows the famous rule: 50% for needs, 30% for wants, 20% goes into a savings account. On paper, he's doing everything right. Now let's look at Alex. His first promotion feels exactly the same. He's excited, tempted by the bigger apartment, the newer car, the lifestyle upgrade. But instead of asking, "What can I buy?" he asks, "What can this pay rise build?" His living expenses barely change. Every extra dollar goes into productive assets, index funds, business investments, eventually, property. His friends think he's being overly cautious. Some even wonder why he still drives the same car. What they don't see is what happens in the background. Because while Paul is spending his income, Alex is quietly increasing the number of assets producing income. And then, something remarkable happens. For the first few years, their financial lives barely look different. That's one of the biggest misconceptions about wealth. Compounding is boring until suddenly it isn't. Around year 10, Alex's investments begin earning meaningful returns. By year 20, those returns begin generating returns of their own. And by year 30, something extraordinary happens. his money is producing more money than he could ever save from his salary alone. That's the power of compounding. Albert Einstein is often credited with calling compound interest the eighth wonder of the world, although historians debate whether he actually said it. Whether he did or not, the principle remains true. Compounding doesn't reward speed, it rewards consistency. Meanwhile, Paul hasn't made catastrophic mistakes. He hasn't been reckless, he simply allowed his spending to rise alongside his income. Every promotion improved his lifestyle, but never fundamentally changed his financial trajectory. By retirement, Paul has savings, Alex has assets. Both worked hard, both earned similar salaries, but one spent 4 decades building income, the other spent 4 decades building ownership, and ownership eventually became income. That's the difference. So, does this mean the 50-30-20 rule failed? Not quite. Because the biggest lesson isn't that the rule is wrong, it's that most people misunderstand what it was ever designed to do, and that changes the conclusion completely. At the beginning of this documentary, we asked a simple question. Has the 50-30-20 rule stopped working after everything we've uncovered? The answer isn't exactly yes, and it isn't no. The truth is more interesting than that. The 50-30-20 rule was never designed to make you wealthy. It was designed to stop financial chaos. And for millions of people, it still does exactly that. If you've never followed a budget before, it remains one of the simplest ways to understand where your money is actually going. But somewhere along the way, people started treating it as the finish line, instead of what it really was, a starting point. Because budgeting, by itself, has never created wealth. Budgeting creates awareness. Awareness creates discipline. Discipline creates surplus. And only when that surplus begins purchasing productive assets, does wealth begin to emerge. That's the journey we have followed together. We started in 2005, when Elizabeth Warren and Amelia Warren Tyagi created a simple framework to help ordinary families regain control over their finances. We saw why it spread across the world. We discovered how inflation quietly changed the assumptions behind the model. We explored why consumer psychology constantly pulls us towards lifestyle inflation. And we uncovered the habit that quietly separates many long-term wealth builders from everyone else. Not earning more, thinking differently. Because the biggest divide wasn't between rich and poor, it was between people who believed money's purpose was to be spent, and people who believed money's purpose was to produce. One group bought bigger lifestyles, the other gradually built bigger systems. One depended on every future paycheck, the other slowly created assets capable of producing future paychecks for them. That's why the question isn't, should I follow the 50-30-20 rule? The better question is, what happens after I master it? Because eventually, every budget reaches its limit. There are only so many coffees you can stop buying, only so many subscriptions you can cancel, only so many expenses you can cut. But there is no limit to how intelligently your capital can work for you. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson this documentary has to offer. Financial freedom doesn't begin when you earn your first million. It begins the moment your money stops being just something you spend and starts becoming something that works alongside you. Maybe that's one investment, maybe it's an index fund, maybe it's building a business, maybe it's buying back your time. The vehicle will look different for everyone. The principle stays exactly the same. Money is a tool, and tools only become powerful when you give them a purpose. So the next time you hear someone mention the 50-30-20 rule, don't ask whether it's right or wrong. Ask something much more powerful. What job is my money doing today? Because the answer to that single question may shape your financial life far more than any budgeting rule ever could. And here's something worth thinking about. If budgeting isn't what ultimately creates wealth, then what does? Because history is filled with ordinary people who never earned extraordinary salaries, yet still became financially independent. What they understood about investing might completely change the way you think about building wealth. In the next documentary, we're going to explore one of the most misunderstood concepts in personal finance: why the richest investors in history, from Warren Buffett to everyday millionaires, keep buying the same seemingly boring investment, while millions of people continue chasing the next big thing. Once you understand that, you'll never look at investing the same way again.